Most people remember the trophies, some remember the victories, but the people who truly knew racing history remember the rumors. They remember the whispers about a man whose ideas seemed to arrive years before the rest of the world was ready for them. A man who could look at a rulebook and discover possibilities no one else could see. Long before modern engineering transformed motorsports, one individual was already imagining the future inside a modest building in Daytona Beach. That man was Smokey Yunick. To some, he was a brilliant innovator. To others, he was a troublemaker who constantly challenged authority. Yet everyone agreed on one thing. Nobody thought like Smokey. Even after decades of competition, controversy, and groundbreaking inventions, his greatest mystery remained hidden from public view. Behind the closed doors of his legendary garage sat secrets that fueled endless speculation throughout the racing world. Engineers wondered what experiments he had never revealed. Drivers talked about machines that supposedly existed only in stories. NASCAR officials often found themselves questioning whether Smokey knew something they didn't. For years, nobody could separate fact from legend because almost nobody was allowed inside. From the outside, the building appeared ordinary. It lacked the glamour people expected from a racing icon. There were no flashing signs, no elaborate displays, and nothing that hinted at the extraordinary ideas developing within its walls. Yet appearances were deceiving. To Smokey, that garage was far more than a workplace. It was a laboratory where imagination was allowed to run free. It was a sanctuary where innovation mattered more than convention and where limitations existed only to be challenged. Every corner contained evidence of a mind that refused to accept that something couldn't be done simply because nobody had done it before. As the years passed, the garage developed an almost mythical reputation. Stories spread through racetracks and workshops across America. Some claimed Smokey was creating engines capable of performance levels the sport had never witnessed. Others believed he possessed revolutionary designs that governing bodies would never approve for competition. Nobody knew how much of the gossip was true, but the uncertainty only made the legend larger. Smokey rarely corrected the rumors. In many ways, the mystery served him well. While others talked, he continued working. When illness began to slow him during the final years of his life, people noticed subtle changes. The energetic rebel who had spent decades battling convention became increasingly reflective. Visitors became rare. Conversations grew shorter. The endless debates about horsepower, aerodynamics, and racing politics gradually gave way to discussions about time, legacy, and unfinished ambitions. Friends who stopped by the shop often found him studying old sketches or examining projects that had occupied his thoughts for years. Sometimes he would simply walk through the building in silence, pausing beside machines and prototypes as though revisiting memories only he could fully understand. Those closest to him sensed there was more happening beneath the surface. Smokey occasionally made comments that sounded almost like clues. He hinted at ideas people were not ready to understand. He joked about projects that would survive long after he was gone. At times, he spoke of unfinished business with a strange confidence, as if he knew certain discoveries would eventually find their audience. The remarks were brief and often dismissed at the time, but later they would take on entirely different meaning. When Smokey passed away in May of 2001, he left behind much more than a career. He left behind questions. Family members and trusted friends suddenly found themselves responsible for a property that had become one of racing's most guarded locations. The garage stood exactly as he had left it, locked away from public curiosity and filled with decades of work nobody had fully cataloged. The building was no longer simply a workshop. It had become a sealed archive of one man's extraordinary mind. Several weeks after the funeral, the doors were finally opened. Those entering expected to find tools, spare parts, and reminders of a long career. What they discovered was something entirely different. Dust coated nearly every surface. Half-finished vehicles rested beneath aging covers like forgotten giants frozen in time. Workbenches overflowed with unusual components. Cabinets contained technical drawings, calculations, and handwritten notes. Yet the most striking aspect wasn't the volume of material. It was the feeling that everything existed for a reason. Nothing appeared accidental. Every shelf, every drawer, and every work table seemed connected to a larger story. One section contained countless carburetor experiments, each accompanied by detailed observations written in Smokey's unmistakable handwriting. Nearby sat boxes identified only by dates, project numbers, and cryptic abbreviations. Some appeared connected to famous racing programs, while others referenced initiatives nobody present recognized. There were parts that matched no known production engines and designs unlike anything commonly used in motorsports. The deeper they explored, the clearer it became that they were not sorting through ordinary memorabilia. They were uncovering evidence of a lifetime spent pursuing ideas that often existed far ahead of contemporary technology. The garage felt less like a storage building and more like a museum assembled by a genius who never expected visitors. Every discovery generated new questions. Why had certain projects remained hidden? Why had some concepts never reached competition? And perhaps most importantly, how many innovations had remained trapped within these walls while the rest of the racing world moved forward, unaware of what Smokey had already imagined years earlier? As the search continued, those questions only multiplied, and the mystery surrounding the legendary mechanic began growing larger than ever before. Among the countless discoveries scattered throughout the garage, one object seemed to carry a warning of its own. A weathered wooden crate sat tucked between stacks of forgotten components. Across its surface, written in bold handwriting, was a message that immediately caught everyone's attention. Don't touch until you know what you're doing. It sounded less like a label and more like a challenge. As the investigation continued, a larger truth began to emerge. Smokey hadn't spent decades simply constructing race cars. He had been preserving ideas, documenting battles, and leaving behind evidence of a lifelong struggle between innovation and limitation. Nothing inside the building appeared random. The layout might have seemed chaotic to an outsider, but every corner reflected intention. Aging blueprints remained pinned to walls exactly where he had left them. Their paper had yellowed with time, yet the engineering concepts still looked remarkably advanced. Metal tables held unfamiliar components that appeared to belong to experimental fuel systems. Nearby shelves contained prototypes that nobody could immediately identify. The garage felt less like a workshop and more like a conversation extending across decades, one that Smokey expected future generations to finish. At the far end of the building stood a locked cabinet that immediately attracted attention. Once opened, it revealed folders filled with correspondence, technical discussions, and what appeared to be private exchanges involving influential figures from the racing world. Many of the documents contained sharp criticism, bold predictions, and warnings that seemed directed at officials who had repeatedly challenged his ideas. Reading through them felt like stepping into the middle of a long-running conflict. Every page reinforced the same conclusion. Smokey had never been interested in fitting comfortably within the system. He wanted to improve it, whether others appreciated the effort or not. Then came a discovery that left everyone speechless. Hidden beneath an old canvas cover and surrounded by boxes that looked untouched for years was an unusual fuel delivery prototype, unlike anything anyone expected to find. Compact and strangely engineered, it immediately stood apart from conventional designs. Beside it rested several notebooks and sketches written in Smokey's own hand. The documents described a method of fuel management that appeared capable of producing extraordinary efficiency and performance while remaining technically compliant with the rules of its era. The notes were revealing. One contained a blunt statement suggesting the design would never be accepted because it was simply too effective. Another implied that if officials refused to allow it on the track, it would remain hidden indefinitely. Whether the comments reflected frustration or certainty was impossible to know. What was clear, however, was that Smokey believed strongly in the concept. The more researchers examined the documents, the more they realized this wasn't an unfinished experiment. It was a completed idea that had never received the opportunity to prove itself in competition. Stories soon surfaced suggesting that versions of the system had undergone private testing years earlier. According to those accounts, the results had been impressive enough to attract attention from racing authorities. Yet instead of moving forward, the project quietly disappeared. Whether concerns involved safety, fairness, or something else entirely remains a matter of speculation. What cannot be disputed is that the prototype survived. Rather than destroy years of work, Smokey carefully preserved it and stored it away where only time could uncover it. The discovery served as a powerful reminder of the way he approached engineering. He never viewed innovation as a shortcut. To him, it was a challenge to think differently. While others focused on existing solutions, Smokey searched for possibilities nobody had considered. Standing in that garage, surrounded by evidence of ideas hidden from public view, it became obvious that many of his greatest achievements may never have reached a racetrack. The surprises continued. Behind rows of tool cabinets and storage racks sat a collection of engines, unlike anything most visitors had ever encountered. Some were fully assembled and appeared ready for testing. Others had been carefully disassembled, cataloged, and stored with extraordinary precision. Together, they formed what looked like a private archive of engineering experiments spanning decades. These were not ordinary race engines. Each seemed to represent a different path motorsports might have taken. One featured an intake configuration unlike anything commonly used in stock car racing. Another incorporated lightweight materials that would not become mainstream until many years later. Several contained unusual design elements accompanied by handwritten observations, performance calculations, and questions that remained unanswered. It was as though Smokey had spent years exploring alternate futures for racing technology and documenting every step of the journey. One particular prototype drew considerable attention because it appeared to include concepts strikingly similar to technologies embraced by modern motorsports decades later. Whether the design would have worked exactly as intended remains unknown, but the fact that Smokey was exploring such possibilities long before they became common only strengthened his reputation as someone perpetually ahead of the curve. Many engine blocks carried markings that didn't correspond to any known manufacturer. Others featured coded symbols and personal notations. Detailed drawings described advanced fuel delivery concepts, airflow management techniques, and powertrain ideas that seemed almost futuristic for their time. Walking through the collection felt like exploring a hidden chapter of automotive history. Instead of following industry trends, Smokey had been creating his own. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the discovery was that none of these machines ever had the opportunity to demonstrate their potential under race conditions. They existed as possibilities frozen in time, unused, unproven, waiting. Each represented a question that would never receive a definitive answer. How fast could they have been? How influential might they have become? Could they have changed the direction of racing itself? Then the search uncovered something even more revealing than engines or blueprints. Inside a battered metal filing cabinet were dozens of handwritten letters. Some remained sealed. Others had been opened and folded repeatedly over the years. Many were addressed to family members and longtime friends, but several carried the names of drivers, inspectors, executives, and officials connected to the sport that defined his life. What made the collection extraordinary was that many of the letters had never been mailed. They existed only as private thoughts captured on paper. Reading them revealed a side of Smokey that few people ever saw publicly. Behind the confidence, humor, and defiance was a man wrestling with disappointment, frustration, and questions about how history would judge him. Several letters criticized what he believed was an increasing obsession with control at the expense of innovation. Others defended his reputation against accusations that had followed him throughout his career. In one draft, he argued that thinking differently should never be mistaken for wrongdoing. In another, he expressed concern that racing was gradually losing the creativity that had once made it extraordinary. Yet the letters were not entirely bitter. Scattered among the frustrations were jokes, memories, and reflections on friendships built over decades in the sport. There were references to famous competitors, unfinished writing projects, and personal promises he regretted never fulfilling. Together they painted the portrait of a man who loved racing deeply, even when he felt disconnected from the direction it was taking. For those who read them, the documents transformed Smokey from a larger-than-life legend into something far more relatable. They revealed a brilliant innovator who spent years fighting for ideas he believed in, a competitor determined to challenge convention, and a man who sometimes wondered whether his contributions would ever be fully understood. More than any machine hidden inside the garage, those letters exposed the human story behind the myth. The deeper they explored, the more everyone realized that the documents scattered throughout the garage were far more than historical records. They were fragments of a man's soul. Every note, every unfinished letter, and every handwritten observation carried the weight of decades spent challenging convention. Together, they revealed emotions that Smokey rarely shared publicly. Beneath the confidence, humor, and defiance was someone who had devoted his life to a craft he loved, only to spend years fighting against the limitations imposed upon it. These papers represented the final conversations he never had, the arguments he never finished, and the truths he believed deserved to survive long after he was gone. Then came one of the most unexpected discoveries of all. Hidden behind an aging sliding wall panel near the rear of the building was a room few people even knew existed. The moment the concealed space was opened, it felt less like entering a storage area and more like stepping into a personal monument. A single hanging bulb cast long shadows across shelves crowded with trophies, framed photographs, race helmets, driver suits, and memorabilia collected over an extraordinary lifetime. Some items were arranged with remarkable care. Others appeared to have been placed wherever space allowed. The contrast gave the room a deeply personal quality, as though Smokey had intended to organize everything one day but simply ran out of time. Along one wall sat trophies earned at some of motorsport's most prestigious events. Nearby were jackets, patches, and pieces of racing history connected to teams and drivers whose careers had intersected with his own. At the center of the room stood a workbench unlike any other in the garage. Every tool had been cleaned, labeled, and preserved with almost ceremonial respect. It looked less like a workstation and more like a tribute to a lifetime spent solving impossible problems. Yet the objects that drew the greatest attention were not trophies or photographs. They were stacks of old rulebooks covered with handwritten notes. Smokey had filled the margins with calculations, corrections, observations, and sarcastic remarks aimed at regulations he believed misunderstood engineering. Some comments were humorous, others were surprisingly insightful. Together they offered a glimpse into the way his mind worked. While others read restrictions, Smokey searched for opportunities. While others accepted limitations, he questioned whether those limitations made sense in the first place. Pinned prominently to one wall was a photograph of Smokey, standing proudly beside one of his most famous creations. His familiar grin remained frozen in time, cigar clenched between his teeth. Next to the picture was a handwritten note that seemed to summarize his entire career in a single sentence. It suggested that the machine beside him had forced officials to rethink what they believed was possible. It wasn't arrogance, it was history. Around the room sat binders filled with race notes accumulated over decades. Some documented well-known events. Others referenced competitions that had largely faded from public memory. There were performance predictions, airflow calculations, engine studies, and observations recorded with astonishing precision. The sheer amount of information was overwhelming, yet none of it felt like self-promotion. Instead, it felt like evidence. Smokey had spent years documenting his work because he wanted the record to speak for itself. He wasn't trying to convince people he was brilliant. He was preserving proof of what he had accomplished. Then, beneath stacks of aging blueprints and forgotten parts, another discovery emerged. It was a worn leather journal secured with a strip of tape and visibly aged from decades of use. Unlike the technical notes scattered throughout the garage, this journal contained something far more personal. Its pages offered direct access to the thoughts of a man who rarely revealed his deepest feelings to the public. The entries stretched across many years and revealed a side of Smokey few people ever saw. There were reflections on innovation, frustration, ambition, failure, and the burden of constantly thinking beyond the limits accepted by others. Some passages expressed disappointment over ideas that never received a chance to prove themselves. Others explored the loneliness that often accompanies being misunderstood. Yet woven throughout the journal was an unwavering belief in creativity and progress. Again and again, one theme emerged. Smokey wasn't motivated solely by victory. Winning mattered, but innovation mattered more. He seemed haunted by unrealized possibilities. The thought of a great idea being ignored troubled him far more than the prospect of losing a race. Several pages contained sketches of concepts he never built, inventions he never finished, and experiments he wished he had more time to pursue. One section listed future projects he still hoped to attempt. Reading it now felt almost heartbreaking. Even after decades of achievement, his imagination remained restless. The journal transformed the image of Smokey from rebellious engineer into something more complex. It revealed a dreamer, a perfectionist, a man who believed that every unanswered question represented an opportunity waiting to be explored. Above all, it revealed someone who never stopped imagining what might come next. As word spread about the contents of the garage, interest grew rapidly. Visitors arrived hoping to glimpse pieces of the collection. Industry insiders discussed the discoveries privately. Stories circulated about advanced designs hidden among the archives. Before long, reports emerged that individuals connected to the racing establishment had quietly examined portions of the material themselves. Among the most intriguing discoveries was an unusual chassis unlike anything observers expected to find. Its structure appeared unconventional, combining design principles that seemed decades ahead of their time. Built with extraordinary attention to detail, it featured engineering solutions that left even experienced observers struggling to understand its purpose. Rumors quickly followed. Some believed it represented an early exploration of aerodynamic concepts that would become important years later. Others viewed it as evidence that Smokey had been experimenting with entirely different approaches to race car design. Photographs were taken, documents were copied, questions multiplied, yet some of the most unusual pieces remained behind, fueling even more speculation. Why were certain ideas embraced while others were quietly ignored? Why did some discoveries generate excitement while others generated discomfort? No one could say with certainty. But the discussions themselves reinforced a truth that had followed Smokey throughout his life. His ideas had a way of challenging assumptions. Even years after his passing, the contents of that garage continued to provoke curiosity. Engineers debated his methods. Historians studied his notes. Fans revisited stories they once dismissed as exaggeration. The building itself became symbolic of something larger than racing. It represented the power of imagination unconstrained by convention. When the final inventory was completed and the garage doors eventually closed once more, those who had witnessed its contents left with the same conclusion. Smokey Yunick was never simply ahead of his time. Being ahead implies others eventually catch up. In many ways, Smokey seemed to operate outside conventional timelines altogether. He saw possibilities where others saw obstacles. He pursued solutions before problems were widely recognized. He challenged accepted wisdom because he genuinely believed progress demanded it. His garage was not merely a collection of machines and memories. It was a monument to independent thinking. Every blueprint, every prototype, every handwritten note testified to a lifetime spent refusing to accept easy answers. In a world increasingly focused on conformity and predictability, Smokey remained committed to curiosity, experimentation, and the pursuit of better ideas. That is why his story continues to resonate, not because of controversy, not because of rumors, and not even because of victories,